I'm going to move on now to the next item in the agenda, which is another keynote contribution, this time by Professor Richard Murphy. I'll just give you a moment to get ready for that. The theme of this session is a new economic narrative for the left. Richard Murphy is Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University. He is a Fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. He co-founded the Tax Justice Network, the Fair Trade Mark, and Finance for the Future. He founded and still directs Tax Research UK. He co-created the Green New Deal, and he remains an active member of the Green New Deal group. He is founder director of the Corporate Accountability Network. He has written a whole number of books, The Courageous State and The Joy of Tax. In the last 3 years, he's been named by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales as the top social media influencer on accounting issues in the UK for the last 4 years. So Richard, thank you again for being here this morning, for joining us, and over to you.
Well, good morning, and I apologise for not being able to greet you in Welsh. I have a son who's at Aberystwyth University, and I most certainly have mastered some pronunciation in Welsh, simply because I'm a great fan of narrow gauge railways, and of course the two are intimately related, but so far I've not learned any of the language. But I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about something which I think matters. The cooperative movement is important. It's something that John Christensen, with whom I co-founded the Tax Justice Network, and I have talked often about how important it was. And John worked in cooperatives. I haven't, although I've worked with cooperatives, and the Fair Tax Mark did quite a lot of work with them, because I think it's in itself a model of how to reorganize the economy. But I want to talk about something slightly different today, and this talk is based upon an article, and I was invited by David to talk about an article I wrote, I think nearly a year ago, but which was published a couple of times, once on my blog, once in Byline Times, about a new economic narrative for the left. And I entirely agree with what we've just heard from the First Minister about the importance of working with small ideas and making them grow. And in some senses, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm not a revolutionary. Many people call me a radical chartered accountant, which sounds like an oxymoron in itself. And certainly my own profession, I think, do feel that way about me. But I'm definitely not a revolutionary. What I want to find are ways in which we can transform the way that things work to make them of social purpose. And what I'm quite sure about is that at present, we live in an economic paradigm that is not designed to work for the vast majority of people in this country and indeed around the world. So I want to explain that I think there are alternatives to that paradigm. And in particular, I want to talk about the thing which is one of the major themes of my work, and that is how we can find the money to fund our future. The blog I write has now been renamed from Tax Research UK because most of it wasn't about tax anymore, although it was when it started 17 years ago and 20,000 odd blog posts ago, because I write on average 3.3 blog posts a day. But it's now about funding our future. And this is what I want to talk about here, because it's clear that we're not adequately funding our future at present. My argument is quite simple. I think there's only been one period when there has been a left of centre economic paradigm in use in our history, and that was from 1945 to 1975. Now, I wasn't around for the beginning. I was around for the end. I went to university in 1976, just as I think, in effect, that paradigm was coming to an end, with Dennis Healy basically keeling over to the demands of the IMF. And of course, by the time I graduated in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was becoming Prime Minister and everything was going to change. And it moved on to be neoliberalism. But let's just stick with that paradigm for a moment. What identified that paradigm? It was, of course, defined by Clem Attlee's and Nye Bevan's vision, effectively, for what we should be seeing, but also founded upon the Beveridge Report and the work of Lord Keynes as an economist. And the logic came through of the welfare state, the role of the state to run and direct the economy, which had been developed in the Second World War, which led to nationalisation of energy, of transport, of a great deal of housing, let's be totally honest, of the NHS, the provision of education for all in a way that hadn't happened before, and so much else. Plus the control by the state of so many of the functions which manage the economy. The exchange rate was managed by the state. The interest rate was governed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, not by an exceptionally highly paid banker who appears to have no concerns for the interests of ordinary people right now, and so much else. But that paradigm eventually came to an end in the mid-1970s. And I think it came to an end for a number of reasons. Although, of course, we have residues of it still. Let's not pretend otherwise. We still do have a sort of welfare state, just not the sort we'd really like. But why did that era come to an end? And I think it was because of rigidity. I think it was created in a wartime environment, and it didn't eventually live comfortably with the freedom of choice that people wanted. It, of course, was created in an era of empire, and empire went, and we can't forever live off the benefits of empire. And I think a part of that period was built on the benefit of empire, and we have to recognize that that was not only wrong, but actually certainly not replicable. There was the end of the gold standard. Fundamentally, we changed the nature of money in 1971 when the US came off the gold standard, and with that fixed exchange rates and everything else ended. And so the money markets rose in power. But we also got the oil crisis of 1973, which some might remember, and the impact that had, and then the collapse of union relationships with the government, and the three-day working week over inflation that gave rise to, and certain other issues. But fundamentally, and that perhaps just as importantly, I also think there was a lack of critical thinking at the time. There were, of course, some visionaries in Labour at that period, not many, but some, definitely more than there are now. But there wasn't an answer as to what came next, in my opinion. Unfortunately, the right did manage to create that idea of what came next. They'd been working on it ever since 1947. I say that year very particularly because that's the year when Hayek and Milton Friedman and others formed what was called the Mont Pelerin Society, which you may not have heard of. But the Mont Pelerin Society is the absolute birthplace of the economic narrative that led us all the way to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. They are pure Mont Pelerin people. And let's be blunt, so is Rishi Sunak. People who believe that there is no answer to any question but that which the market can provide. And I will be honest with you, and some of you will be aware that I'm critical that too many Labour shadow ministers at present also happen to share that view, and I don't. But fundamentally, the argument that they put forward was that unless it's a market-based solution and government gets out of the way of the delivery of market-based solutions, there is nothing else that matters. And of course, that's just not true. That isn't the way the world has worked. We know that markets fail. We know that the economic theory that underpins this idea is complete nonsense. It makes absurd assumptions, for example, that we all come into the world equal, if only, that we all have equal access to capital, if only, that we all have equal opportunity, if only. And these things, of course, are simply not true. And we know they're not true, but we know in practice they're not true. I mean, if ever there was evidence, the 2008 global financial crisis, in which I was quite an active, in a sense, participant by, first of all, predicting it with others in the Green New Deal group. But secondly, also, I was quite engaged in talking to the Treasury at that period of time and sort of had a pretty clear sense of what was going on in that era. That should have been the point when we said, hang on, let's stop. And very briefly, there were hints of that. Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were trying to do a counter-narrative way of dealing with this, but they lost the 2010 general election because George Osborne told us that we were going to hell in a handcart and would end up like Greece, and he introduced austerity. George Osborne is the architect of our current political malaise and economic malaise by doing so, because he set us on the pathway to this current state we're in, where literally nothing works. And if you want the evidence that neoliberalism doesn't work, well, that's it. The UK economy is not working after 13 years. We're actually seeing that the drive for small government is simply delivering low growth and the lack of opportunity for people, plus the growth in inequality and the growth in absolute poverty. We have a government that seems to exist only to transfer public wealth into private hands, which it has most successfully done in all sorts of ways, including some of those that Mark Drakeford was talking about. It is hideous that we have private companies, private equity companies, who are participating in the provision of children's services and making significant profits from doing so, and yet accessing those services is not possible for nearly enough children who need them in all sorts of ways. So our freedoms, our choices, our opportunities, the level of service that we can provide, all of them are collapsing, and nothing is being done to really embrace the challenges that we face, whether they are climate or AI, which I think is a massive issue that we have to get our heads around, and which exists to transfer yet more wealth from working people to capital. There is no other reason for it. The whole intention is to substitute capital for labor and to increase the return to capital at cost to labor. So there is a massive issue for us to address there, but we haven't addressed failing public services. We haven't addressed inequality. We haven't addressed the problem of private debt either. And that problem is getting very much worse. At this moment, the latest figures from the Bank of England show that last month, £1.6 billion was added to credit card debt in the UK. Why? People who can't afford to make ends meet are literally borrowing on their credit cards to pay for the food that they put on their table. But that's obviously not sustainable for long. And therefore, we have a crisis. We need a new paradigm. We desperately need to know how it is that we can create a new economic well-being, and we need the means to fund that. That's what I want to talk about. And in the article I wrote, I said, the left wants to create a sustainable economy by putting all the resources available within society to best use, including those that the market fails to use to best effect. And I make that point very clearly because, as the late David Graeber would have put it, there's a hell of a lot of shit jobs in the economy right now. Yeah, it's claimed that we have full employment, but a great many people are doing work which is frankly pretty meaningless, demeaning, and only provides a reward in the sense of a pay packet. Those people are not being put to best use. There are so many skills amongst so many people across Wales, across the whole of the economy, that are not being used to best effect. And we all, I think, can think of examples of that. And so it's not just enough to say we're going for full employment, but we're going to do what we can do best. And in a sense, I'm echoing words from Lord Keynes in 1942, when he spoke on the BBC, and he was the economic guru who very much guided the UK economy through both the First and Second World Wars to find the money to pay for those wars. And he said, we can afford whatever it is that we are capable of doing. And I think that point's really important. If we can work out what we can do, and we can certainly do better than we are now, my argument is that we can afford it. So my point then is, why is it that it is said we can't afford it? Why is it that Keir Starmer is making a speech today about everything that he wants Labour to do? And yet I note that in the publication that came out from Labour this week, there is an absolute commitment to hard and fast fiscal rules, no borrowing, the power of the independent Bank of England to impose rules upon the government, and all the sorts of things which neoliberalism is using to constrain the current government, and which will be used to constrain a Labour administration if they can do so. So what is it that we need to learn? Well, the first thing we need to learn is that a government cannot run out of money. For 13 years, the Tories have lived on that note that Liam Byrne, and I've discussed that note with Liam Byrne, wrote when he left the Treasury saying, sorry to whoever his successor might be, there is no money left. That is simply impossible. All money is created by the government. It isn't created by anyone else. Go and try and print your own £5 notes and see how far you get in how long your freedom lasts for, to just prove the point. Money is made by government. It cannot run out of it. It's all made by the Bank of England at the end of the day, or by banks that the Bank of England regulates to create it. And we know this now, because QE has proved the point. QE created £895 billion of new money between 2009 and 2021. It didn't result in a single iota of noticeable inflation. Actually, it probably did, but austerity was so severe that it counteracted the effect of austerity. And it certainly didn't create the inflation that we are suffering now, which was caused by the post-COVID reopening, which was too quick and so poorly managed, and of course by war in Ukraine, about which Mick spoke so ably earlier. And I'm not going to repeat the point, but Ukraine obviously has had a massive economic impact. Not actually, largely because of market speculation on the basis of the war, rather than because of real impacts. And it's worth making that point. But QE did not create inflation, but it did prove that the government can create vast amounts of money. It also cancelled large parts of the national debt. Let's be quite clear. If you owe yourself money, it's a pretty great place to be in. Just imagine that your mortgage was owed to, well, yourself. You'd have no problem making the payment, would you? And the government is actually in that situation. 1/3 of its debt is owed to itself. Hardly surprisingly, that debt burden is not real, but the Tories will tell you it's got to be paid and our grandchildren have got to repay it. Utter nonsense. So this proves that the government can create money, but it proves some other things as well. First of all, it proves that we don't have to balance the books, because the government actually can balance the books whenever it wishes by simply creating money. Balancing the books, I can tell you as a chartered accountant, has got nothing to do with actually making your cash flow be equal. And any business will say that actually a balanced cash flow is normally the way to end up with a business disaster or a flat line and no growth. If you actually want to grow, you have to run a negative cash flow and borrow to actually fuel growth. So it's a completely stupid argument that we actually should do something in government that no business would dream of, which is to balance the cash flow. But secondly, what it says is the government isn't in hock to the financial markets. Because if the financial markets don't want to lend money to the government can just say, that's fine, we'll make it ourselves. When you want to come back to us, if you want to save with us again, and that is, by the way, all that financial markets do, they don't lend money to the government because the government doesn't need to borrow their money because it can create its own money instead. All they do is provide a safe place for people to save. And so if we learn all these things, which the last 13 years, 14, 15 years really of experience since 2008 have told us, then we suddenly realize that there's something very radical going on in our economy, and that we're not dependent on money markets. We're not constrained by them. We're not constrained by lending. And if we take these ideas just a little further and notice some other parts of the world, and I've done quite a lot of work with colleagues at Sheffield and elsewhere around this issue, you'll also note that actually the stock market is almost irrelevant in terms of our economy as well now. On the hour, every hour, the BBC pretty much will tell you what the FTSE 100 is at. Who cares? Because do you know what? No money that the FTSE now provides goes to companies to create employment or new investment opportunities. The FTSE is merely a casino. There are almost no new shares ever issued on it. If they are, they're only part of merger and acquisition activity. It doesn't provide the funding for economic growth. So what is this obsession with the City of London and the financial markets all about? Well, it's really because the power of the markets and those who are employed with them is what matters. And again, Mark hit on this issue earlier on. He said, the power of people to actually lobby the government, to threaten the government, is very real. And I guess one of my themes in my book, The Courageous State, was I'm looking forward to the day when we have politicians who'll stand up and say to those who have power but irresponsibility that they, politicians, have power and responsibility, and they are going to equate those two. That is my vision. So what we need to do is address the fact that financial capitalism has reached the point where it is simply about financial engineering. It's simply about running a casino. It's running companies for the benefit of managers and directors, where takeovers and mergers matters much more than real investment in the provision of genuine public services, and that privatization has only resulted in exploitation, of which water is just the latest obvious evidence, but the rail industry is another perfect example. So we've got to somehow do something different. And thinking about that with a colleague, Andrew Baker at Sheffield, we looked at where is UK wealth? And we did some work based upon Office for National Statistics data and found that 80% of the UK's financial wealth, and there's £8.4 trillion worth of UK wealth, which is roughly 3.8 times our annual income. So 8.4 trillion of financial wealth is invested in the UK, and 80% of it is in tax incentivized assets, by which I mean pension funds, some forms of property, venture capital trusts, and ISAs. Now, that's a staggering amount. What we're talking about is a figure of over 6 trillion is invested in ways that the government effectively subsidizes. And we said, well, if the government effectively subsidizes this, surely it should have some power over the use of that money. And this is exactly what I want to talk to you about, because I think we've reached a point, and this is relevant in the context of cooperatives, because cooperatives obviously had this major particular ancillary, which was the building society movement, which was effectively a form of cooperative, and through credit unions and other related issues where people's money was saved with them and then used very obviously for public purpose in the community in which they lived. And that form of association between savings and public service and community in which people lived has been completely lost. I suspect most people who are on this Zoom call this morning have no idea what their pension fund is used for. And how can you? Because they don't tell you. But it will be invested, they say, in shares, but you don't know what those shares are for, and on and on. We don't even know, frankly, what most government bonds are used for. And yet, that's the only choice we're given. And what I want to do is reintroduce a form of cooperation into the financial markets. And we do that by changing the way in which tax subsidies are given to savers. Now, this is my big radical idea. The subsidy to savers costs £60 billion a year in the UK. That's 1.5 times the defence budget. Let's put it in context. This is heading to be a significant part of education budgets. I'm not sure, and I should have checked this figure, how big it is in proportion to the budget of the Government of Wales, but I know it's darn nearly the size of the budget of the Government of Scotland, so I suspect it's quite a lot more than the budget of the Government of Wales as a consequence. And that's how much we are spending subsidising pensions and ISAs. And the vast majority of that subsidy goes to those who are already wealthy. In fact, so significant is the distortion in the subsidy that is given that my research suggests that the top 10% of people in the UK get a bigger subsidy per week for their savings from the government by way of tax relief than the 40%, the lowest 40% of income earners get by way of benefit payments. There really is a benefit system for the rich in this country, and it's called pension and savings subsidies. And I believe that's wrong. Or at least, I believe if we're going to continue with this, then we have to attach social conditions to this form of subsidy. And we have to for one very important reason, which I think is absolutely fundamental. And that is that actually the existing forms of savings are failing us anyway. It's not just neoliberalism is failing us. The form of pension that is being created as a result of these subsidies is also failing us. There is what I call a fundamental pension contract in a society. That is that people of my age, the grey heads, should, by the time they reach retirement age, and I reach state retirement age within the next year, should have created during their working lives sufficient real capital for use by the next generation, so that the next generation can give up part of their income to look after old people in their old age, which one day will hit me, but which most certainly I don't think will in the next year, and I have no plan that it will. I'm carrying on working for as long as I possibly can. But the point is that we do need to rethink about that intergenerational contract. And this is part of what this new social contract, and I would call it that I want to create is. And so how do we do this? Fundamentally, we do it by changing the way in which these subsidies are given to savings to rebuild that social contract and to provide the capital for what I'm describing as this new cooperative social contract. So we take away some of the subsidy to pension schemes, not all of it. My suggestion is very simple. Well over £100 billion a year, well over 5% of national income, goes into pensions every year in the UK. If we said that 25% of that money had to be used to be invested in new public works, or works which created employment and were a public benefit because they delivered either socially desirable outcomes or net zero outcomes, or preferably both, let's be totally honest, we would release maybe 30 billion a year into the economy for use, for investment in the things that we know we need. Remedial works, because there's so much to be put right about our economy, getting our water right, getting our hospitals right. There's a hospital near where I am right now, which used to be my local hospital, which is literally held up by steel scaffold poles, because otherwise it's at risk of falling down. We have water systems that we know which are rotten. We have railways which we know are not able to withstand the demand upon them. We have energy systems that aren't good enough. We need new energy creation. We need new insulation and so on. All these measures. This would deliver 30 billion of that. In other words, it would deliver all the money that Labour has promised, because it said it would deliver £28 billion a year for this purpose, by making that one simple change. But there would be no cost to the government, because this money would come from pension funds. We're just attaching a new condition to the pension relief we're already giving and getting money back in exchange. And there's another bigger change to make, and curiously, that's on ISAs. And most people find it very hard to believe that £70 billion a year goes into ISAs every year in the UK. Now, some of that is recycled from old accounts, but the net figure going in is over 40 billion. And anyway, I'm only talking about rules applying to new accounts when I'm mentioning this here. And if you change the rules on ISAs and said that every single penny saved in an ISA, because the wealthy are desperate to put their money into tax-free savings accounts, which they are, and there are now even ISA millionaires because they've put so much money into these accounts. If they want to continue to get their tax-free savings, that money must be saved in a green bond. And that green bond, whether issued by a private company or, frankly, more likely by a government agency or government, and it could be the Welsh government, it could be councils in Wales, whoever issues that bond has to use the proceeds, again, to provide a net zero carbon compliant public benefit, which creates new employment. There have never been net withdrawals. In other words, overall gross withdrawals from ISAs. Every year, the balances keep on going up. So there's no risk that this money would actually ever need to be repaid as such. It appears that ISAs are always going up in value. But we could use that money, all of that money, as the capital to provide the basis for this transformation that we know society needs. Put these numbers together, make a few other tweaks around it, and I can find you near enough 100 billion. To fund this transformation, a bigger investment fund than any political party has ever thought of creating. And all I am suggesting is changing a few rules about how money is saved, taking money out of the casino, the stock market, and putting it into programs of public benefit work, which will create employment and deliver sustainability. That's it. What I want is to create the opportunity that people know what their savings will be used for. What I want is them to understand that the money could go for the benefit of their local community. I'd love there to be a Gwyneth fund or a Pembroke fund, or a Welsh fund, or a Welsh education fund, if you like, or a Welsh green fund. And I actually think people should have those choices. This is about hypothecation. I hate hypothecated taxation, but I don't think it's at all inappropriate when it comes to capital. Of course, government would have to fill in the gaps if we didn't get money in all the right places. But the other great advantage would be that this would restore that intergenerational contract. Young people would see that older people's savings, their parents' savings, their grandparents' savings, were creating jobs for their long-term benefit, and the apprenticeships and the training with union-backed employment with all working rights and security associated with it. This is where we can go. This is the answer to the how are you going to pay for it question, which will always be presented to a politician who wants to change anything of consequence. The answer is, I'll pay for it using savers' money, by putting savers' money to public use, by letting people see that if we work cooperatively with savers, working with working people, working with society, we can generate value. Then we have the answer to the transformation that our society needs. And this will put social well-being back at the center of the economy, which is where I think the left want to be. And that's why I think that this idea, simple as it is, could be transformational. Thanks very much.